Independence is not about picking a new patron or proving that you are brave enough by angering an old one. Independence is about building a continent that cannot be squeezed out by anyone, whether that pressure comes from Washington, Beijing, or anywhere else. Proposition is asking African states to massively scale up a policy whose success depends on external reactions they cannot control, especially in a world where Joseph said that the downside is financial isolation and long term instability. Note, awkwardly, this is not an actor motion. That's why in Joseph's first minute, it was already clarified that all of them are out of the spirit of the motion. We should weigh in the basis of general welfare and geopolitical relations in the first place. With the current trend of Trump actively terrorizing states that are extensively against their ideologies, not in line with them, and taking Gov's model laid down by PM that Venezuela, Cuba, and other states will be the one that they're going to take financial transaction into, they have mentioned we already mentioned that they are currently suffering with U.S. retaliation. Meaning, I don't really think we will garner a good welfare outcomes from this transaction, anyways, since they will just ask for a higher rate due to their scarcity of their bonds and regress. So even if we take up their moral stance of helping a country that is suffering, how would you ensure help when you are bringing down Africa with you? And this can be clarified in two folds. One, when they will take up a responsibility to fix or alleviate these issues that they don't have any concerns to begin with, which requires loads of utility to do so. Two, they will most likely suffer third-party retaliation from US, especially if you see the trend of on how they ostracize states that seems to interfere with their interests because this is a risk area for them. And I'm going to make this clearer in twofold. And I'm going to make this clearer later on. Since teams are so lazy to do their burden, they never clarified how does significantly increase looks like. And please take note that we're the only team to tie this back to the spirit of the motion. Significant increase looks like one, pushing Africa to deal with higher rates, despite of them having few utility as mentioned earlier. That's why we keep on asking, why would you place a burden for a continent to help someone outside of their proximate responsibility when they themselves need help also in the first place? The quality of their help is not going to suffice any substantial amount, and it would also push down the one that's going to do it. And two, pushing Africa to turn these economic issues into a larger political issue, since it would look like they're starting a coalition against US, a coalition that are far too weak to stand on its own, is just simply precarious. This is what teams in this debate don't concede into. Increasing trades with sanctioned states turns Africa into the main terrain for sanctions evasion and proxy competition and retaliation, since there would be the one starting this in the first place, wherein it is going to raise domestic instability and conflict risk. It's not going to annoy the US, it's going to put your country in the radar. The moment that this becomes a deliberate strategic increase in trade beyond basic necessity, it stops looking like a survival and starts looking like a statement that it becomes a virtue signal aimed at the US. But the reality is the consequences won't land on Washington, they will land on Africa in the first place. Because take a look at the difference between having proper trade strategy in Gulf. In our side, we still have the freedom to take transactions with any country, even if they are sanctioned. The clinch here is that Africa will freely trade based on necessity. They don't need to push political agenda with huge margin of probable loss, i.e., it's not a planned scheme. You don't need to quote unquote significantly increase. You just need to properly trade in the first place. That's why you don't select, you just put it based on your necessity. That's why also the harms are very, very likely to exist, which awkwardly beats out all of the vague, unrealistic benefits from Gulf. Note that it's only in CO where we got the clear probability on the harms that we call out. This is where you strengthen the US hegemony when you play around their ability to run it down with another area. So as much as possible, we don't give them an incentive to do so in Africa. Contrary to what Gov claims, right now, the market and geographical location of your country decides which is the best suitable partners for a state's trade. It's not the US deciding this solely because you have large actors like Japan, US, China, and EU, for example. In comparison to the crux of OO is that they think that US wants everyone to opt with them. But no, in reality, they don't have that much utility to target non-risk areas that don't actively disalign with them or don't actively attack them. Just don't mess with them in the first place in order for you to not be a target at all. So if you weigh down the conditions of our pathway, as Joseph laid down, we are not bootlickers of US, but at the same time, we don't align our relations based on what US hates, based on what US wants, and based on what US sanctions. Since what they like and what they hate shouldn't decide the conditions for your state, especially when there's an objective table for that. i.e. the global banks and economic market. Note that the US does not actually control Africa's international agreements. So I don't know why is that happening in the first place in this debate. At this point, pretending that Africa has no agency in shaping its trade policy is just simply disingenuous. African states already maintain extensive and growing economic relationships with China, the US literal main global competitor, and they do so openly at the scale without being cut off from international system because they make it look like it's based on necessity in the first place. That reality proves the point that Africa is now trapped under one power's command. So I don't get any necessity coming from Gulf teams, and I don't get the comparative coming from OO. It has no room. It has the room to negotiate, diversify, and pursue its interests. And the pathway coming from us is the only clear and viable path on this. This is where we put Joseph's analysis, or this is where Joseph's analysis becomes much more crucial. But before that, I'll take a POI. 3, 2, 1. Okay. If the goal is independence, which is the metric of OG, CG, and CO, because OO wants to be a dog of US, the most principled strategy is to reduce reliance on any great powers permission structure based on their preferences by building intra-African trade and production capacity, not by becoming a key outlet for sanctioned economies. Inside, this is where you take regionalism, especially when you have ECOWAS, PAPSS, AFCTFA to take care into. If Africa wants independence, the principal path is integration and self-sufficiency. Regionalism kills debt trap because it reduces Africa's need to borrow just to survive external shock by making them much more reliant on their own growth coming from trade and production within the continent. And this is where we provide them with insolvency. So, parenthetically, we remove the problem in geopolitical relations that we have. We don't treat them as an actor motion. And we also prevent US from escalating any more problems right now. Parenthetically, if Africa becomes a major trade artery for sanctioned countries, the US and its partners do not just sit there. And that's the problem with side affirmative. So if you view this in lieu of THBT motion, this is where you bring more benefits in the current geopolitical states. So even if we upside this, it is smaller, reversible, and rather than the downside coming from the comparative of Gulf. That's why you don't hand out bread to others while your own household is hungry at the table. Proud to oppose.